So picture this, you're jolted awake by an explosion, smoke fills your hallways, and strangers in tactical gear are screaming at you, screaming at your spouse, holding you guys at gunpoint, pulling you out half naked, and later you find out that none of this was actually meant for you. Then the government claims that you can't even challenge what happened because their agents had discretion to plan the raid however they wanted and also to get it wrong. The Supreme Court recently struck that down in a 9-0 decision, and now the 11th Circuit has reopened the case and will decide what accountability really means. So let's talk about what is happening in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. Also double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you. And I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is First Form. You guys know that First Form is an amazing company. They're pro-freedom, pro-America. They support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel. And also they have amazing supplements. So if you're trying to get healthier, maybe you have a New Year's resolution, check them out using the link down below. And if you order any supplements, you can get a free 5-pack of protein sticks. Again, just use that link down below. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court. And this is a case that gun owners should be aware of, and really anyone in the United States should be aware of because it impacts your constitutional rights. This case is called Martin versus the United States, and it comes out of a suburban Atlanta area back in 2017 where the FBI executed a pre-dawn raid against a family. Now, the only problem with that pre-dawn raid was that they got the wrong home. The family inside sued the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. Now, the question for the court became, does the federal government get to walk away from liability, or can someone actually hold them accountable for those types of critical mistakes? Now, on review, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of the family and remanded the case back down to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals for a new ruling. And now the 11th Circuit has set this challenge for oral arguments, which will happen early next year. Now, here's what happened in this critical case. Essentially, the FBI was executing a raid against a home where they believe some gang members were, hiding. They had a specific address that they were going to target, but instead of going there directly, one of the FBI special agents who was in charge of planning the raid used his personal GPS to get the location. Now, the issue is that the GPS actually routed him to a completely different home. It went to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her partner at the time, her boyfriend, I believe, and their 7-year-old son. And they lived about 3 doors down from the location that the FBI agents actually wanted to go to. When the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated some flashbang grenades, pulled out her boyfriend and her as well. They were hiding in a closet with a shotgun because, they're being, raided early in the morning. I guess they didn't know what was going on, so they hid in the closet with a shotgun. So they pulled them out, pointed the gun at Katrina Martin, pulled her out half dressed, handcuffed them, also pulled out the child. Now, after all this was happening, after, they were handcuffed and detained, the agents were looking around in the home, and one of the agents saw a coffee table and there was some mail on it, and he noticed that the address on the mail was a different location. That's when they had this huge oh crap moment that we raided the wrong home, we were at the wrong house, and that's when they let them go. They said that they would come back and explain what was happening, and they left and went 3 doors down and executed their raid against the correct home. Now, in response to this situation, the family brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA, which is a law that allows ordinary people to sue the federal government and some agencies like the FBI when certain wrongful acts are created by their employees when those employees are acting in the scope of their job. Now, normally the government and its individuals are, shielded from this type of lawsuit, but the FTCA is one of those situations where the government and Congress has agreed to let people bring torts claims against them in federal courts. But the FTCA also comes with a long list of exceptions where you cannot bring these types of lawsuits. Now, one of those exceptions is known as the discretionary function exception, and that is something that was brought up by the FBI in response to this whole case. That exception shields the federal government when the wrongful act stems from an official making a discretionary decision, and that's supposed to mean a decision that involves judgment, choice, or policy considerations. So in this case, the family tried to sue the FBI for the agent's actions of getting the wrong home, using his GPS and raiding the wrong, address. They tried to bring that claim under the FTCA, but the FBI said that the FBI agent using his personal GPS and how they planned the raid and how they potentially got the wrong home, that is a discretionary function which you cannot bring a lawsuit against. When the family filed their lawsuit in the district court, the government moved to dismiss the case, arguing both that the intentional tort and discretionary function exceptions in the FTCA barred this type of claim, and the district court on review sided with the FBI and the federal government. The case was then appealed to the 11th Circuit, and on review, once again, the 11th Circuit ruled in favor of the FBI. The appeals court reasoned that the lead agent had discretion in how he prepared for the raid. That discretion, they said, was enough to trigger this discretionary function exception, which meant that the family's lawsuit could not move forward. This case then went to the United States Supreme Court, and on review, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the family. The Supreme Court, in that ruling and in that opinion, which was written by Justice Gorsuch, vacated the 11th Circuit's ruling and sent the case back down for re-review. The Supreme Court held first that the law enforcement proviso only modifies the intentional tort exception. It does not override all other exceptions in the FTCA. Now, that's kind of a technical point, but essentially the FBI was trying to say that this one exception in the FTCA applies to all the different provisions that it mentions. The Supreme Court said that is not the case, so they rejected that argument. Second, the Supreme Court vacated and remanded the case back to the 11th Circuit for rebriefing on whether the discretionary function exception bars the Martins' negligent and intentional tort claims that they brought against the FBI for that wrong house raid. Recently, the DOJ filed their response in this case, and in that they argued that the 11th Circuit should still rule the same exact way despite what the Supreme Court just said in their ruling. They argued that the 11th Circuit should rule the same way because the family's claims are still barred under other laws like qualified immunity and also still under the FTCA. The government's central position is that the agent's mistaken entry into the wrong home resulted directly from discretionary rulings and decisions about essentially how they're going to conduct that pre-dawn surveillance, how to approach the house in the dark, how to navigate without alerting any suspects, and how to identify the structure from external features. One of the things that was disputed in this case was, should the FBI have taken additional time to make sure that they identified the correct home, especially since they did some prior surveillance? The FBI claimed that they did not have time to double check the address because the address numbers weren't on the front of the home, but they said also they did not check the mailbox because they didn't have enough time and they wanted to execute the raid as fast as possible without alerting anyone. Well, now this case is heading for re-arguments in the 11th Circuit in light of what the Supreme Court just said. The 11th Circuit has set oral arguments to take place in this case during the week of March 23rd. So soon the appeals court will once again reevaluate this case based on what the Supreme Court just said. Now, you may be asking, what does any of this have to do with gun owners? How does this impact our constitutional rights? Now, here's why this is so critical. Wrong house raids, mistaken identity arrests, and excessive force situations, impact a lot of law-abiding gun owners. We have a lot of high profile, a lot of media coverage relating around, lawful gun owners being raided by various agencies. And when something like that happens, especially when a law-abiding gun owner, potentially wants to act in self-defense or just has a gun, there are some deadly consequences, sometimes for the agents and then sometimes for the individual inside the home. If the government can hide behind this so-called discretion every single time that they make a huge mistake, well, then there is absolutely no accountability for the federal agencies. The Supreme Court's ruling in Martin narrows the government's ability to avoid these lawsuits by claiming this type of broad immunity. These cases reinforce that the federal government and potentially the individual agents can be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or misuse their powers. So that is what's happening in another significant and critical 9-0 unanimous ruling that was issued by the Supreme Court. And once again, this is dealing with a critical, situation that is now being reviewed by the 11th Circuit in light of what the Supreme Court just said. It will be interesting to see how does this now play out in the 11th Circuit. Are they going to stay true to the same ruling? Are they going to agree with the FBI that they should simply just rule the same way despite what the Supreme Court said? That is currently what the administration is arguing for in this lawsuit. So we're going to see how does this play out in the 11th Circuit, and are they going to buy those arguments? So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, you can check out one of the 2 videos here on the screen that the YouTube algorithm thinks that you'll find helpful. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.